Good morning, and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder, and this is BRN Weekly for Saturday, February 6th, 2021. And our top story today, the impact on small businesses and small business owners in the early stages of the pandemic. Well, joining me now to discuss this and a lot more is Olivia Kim. She's a doctoral candidate at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Olivia, great to see you. Thanks for joining us in the program this morning.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And look, you just wrote a great paper for the National Bureau of Economic Research with some colleagues. And this is absolutely stunning information. And I think it's really important for the audience to hear this. So first, let's talk about, and the paper was on small businesses. You're going to get to a lot of the details. But let's talk first about how small businesses did at the outset of the pandemic in terms of consumption, in terms of revenue.
Great. So that's right, Jeff. So by now, it's no secret that the COVID-19 pandemic had a significant economic toll on small businesses, which raises the question of how large were the damages that were just experienced by these small businesses and their owners. So in a joint work, as you described, that I have with Professors Jonathan Parker and Antoinette Shore at MIT, we tackled this question by analyzing the performance of roughly 380,000 small businesses in the early stages of the pandemic. We use a data set from JP Morgan Chase Institute, which is a think tank that uses anonymized, de-identified data set on Chase clients to provide data analysis that informs public debate for the public good. And this data set is really truly unique and ideal for understanding the effect of the pandemic on small businesses, because we can track the cash flows that are coming in and out of the financial accounts of small businesses. And this high frequency view of what is going on in their financial accounts are of course very valuable for grasping what is going on these small businesses. So using this data, what we find is that the pandemic had an enormous effect on small businesses. In the weeks following the national emergency, which was around March of 2020, March of last year, average revenues declined by more than 40% relative to the year before. And this collapse in revenues hasn't recovered back to the pre-pandemic level by the end of May of last year. So we took a closer look at whether the pandemic had a differential effect across businesses with different characteristics to better understand what are some factors about the businesses that makes them more or less resilient in this crisis. But overall, what we find is that the size of the revenue drop is actually very similar across businesses with different characteristics, whether you're a smaller small businesses or larger, smaller business, or whether you're a non-employer firm or an employer firm. So we do find that essential businesses perform slightly better than non-essential businesses, but even essential businesses experience about 30% decline in their revenue. So really just highlights the pandemic was a national shock that had a devastating effect on small businesses across the board.
Now, Olivia, what about the correlation between the number of infections and the national emergency that you indicated that we all are living through and the lockdowns? How does that correlate in terms of how small businesses did or didn't do?
Right, that's right. So there are so many factors that could explain this disruption in the small business sector. As you already mentioned, Jeff, some of these factors include the rise in cases of infections or the fact that there was this implementation of nationwide lockdown measures. But there are, of course, other possible factors that indirectly affected small businesses. So for instance, as a small business owner, you might actually have less time to work on your business if, for instance, now with increased housework, you have to, by taking care of your family members who might be sick or people who are just spending more time at home. And alternatively, even though your businesses per se may not have been directly affected by the pandemic, it's also possible that there has been this supply chain effect, supply chain disruption that kind of slow down the production of your goods because the inputs that you need to produce goods have been slowed down. So of course, there are all these factors, like you said, that are correlated in many ways. So it's really hard to quantify all of the mechanisms that are at play. But in our research, we try to unpack the relative importance of at least the factors that we can measure very well, like infection rate, or the implementation of non-pharmaceutical interventions like shelter in place. So what we find that the large drop in revenues is actually predominantly explained by nationwide factors. Once we actually account for what's going on in the economy-wide trends and compare businesses across areas that have high infection rates versus lower infection rates, or businesses that are facing this lockdown measures versus that are not, the difference in their performance is actually not very large. Specifically, each new case per 1,000 residents in your county leads to about 0.5% drop in revenues, and shelter-in-place order leads to about 2.5% drop in your revenues. So what this means is that if there are two businesses in the same area that has the same exposure to the infections, then the difference in their performance, once you account for what's going on at the national level, is only 2.5%. That said, of course, this analysis was done at the early stages of the pandemic, where the levels of the infections are like nowhere close to what we're seeing now. So just purely speculating, like I wouldn't be surprised if the role of the infections were much larger now.
Yeah, and Olivia, I mean, this, we're talking about data that JP Morgan has gathered and you and the team have analyzed, but there are some real individual consequences here. Small business owners, family members, and so I want to get your thoughts about that. We've only got a few minutes left, but I want to get your thoughts about that, the impact there, and also the impact of the fiscal stimulus measures, if you wouldn't mind.
Right. Okay. So as you mentioned, I think it's extremely important to not just understand the effect on small businesses, but also on the owners of the businesses, because these businesses primarily rely on their businesses to derive income. So you might expect that when there's a large impact of the pandemic, that the well-being of the owners may also be affected. So similar to revenues, we also find that the owner's consumption, the owner's household consumption, or their personal spending, which is a widely used measure of someone's well-being, has also declined by 40%, just like revenue. But of course, as we discussed earlier, Jeff, there are a host of reasons why there could be this collapse in consumption. So what we try to do in the paper is to trace out the pass-through of the revenue drop into the consumption of the owners. And what we actually find is that even though there are large differences in revenue declines between two types of businesses, the consumption patterns of these owners are actually pretty similar. So precisely for every dollar decline in business revenue, the owners of that businesses cut back on consumption spending by only 2 cents. So while the pandemic had led to major declines in business revenues and owners' consumption, so again, owners' consumption also dropped by 40%. Once we compare businesses that experience different magnitude of the revenue decline, that the difference in the revenue losses into the consumption of the owners was actually fairly limited. Now, as you also mentioned, what was the role of the federal and state fiscal stimulus measures? And we definitely think those measures are one of the factors that provided financial buffers to businesses and their owners. We actually see that by the end of May, median small business owners had roughly 18% higher balances in their checking accounts relative to January of 2020. So, but we think that there are other measures, other factors that are also important. So the first one is the liquidity of the small businesses and owners entering the crisis. We find that even with the stimulus measures, that the pass-through of the revenue to the consumption is actually much larger for businesses who entered the crisis with lower levels of liquidity. And also, the pandemic itself limited the owner's ability to consume. So of course, we go out to restaurants much less now, and we spend less on personal services, so the demand for those goods have declined. So all of these factors, I think, including the effect of the stimulus response, have limited the pass-through effect of revenues to consumption.
Yeah, well, look, I think, and I'm sure that there will be follow-up studies. I think there's going to be a lot of lessons learned from this in terms of stimulus, in terms of keeping small businesses open and working. Olivia, I want to thank you and your team very much. I want to thank you, of course, for stopping by, but also thank your team for this very important research. And we look forward to having you back on the program again very soon.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. Thanks again.
Thank you, Olivia. Great to see you. Thanks for sharing your perspective. And when we come back, some of our best segments for the week. You're going to want to stay tuned right here on BRN Weekly. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms, especially for the smaller businesses? I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network.
Hi folks, Joe Namath here, and if you're on Medicare, this is important. You're now entitled to eliminate copays and get dental care, dentures, eyeglasses, prescription coverage, in-home aids, unlimited transportation, and home-delivered meals, all at no additional cost. Plus, your zip code may have coverage with the Give Back benefit that adds money back to your Social Security check every month. Look, with the uncertainty of the virus and vaccines, you need to get everything you're entitled to. Here's the bottom line. Call to get significant benefits at no additional cost and see if your zip code has coverage with the Give Back benefit. Millions of people have trusted the Medicare Coverage Helpline. You can too. Call now. It's free.
Call 1-800-924-3920. That's 1-800-924-3920.
Welcome back. On Monday, I sat down with Groom Law's David Levine to discuss the ever-evolving area of 401k fee litigation. Let's take a look.
I think it would be a lie to say fee litigation is slow. It's really, really busy. And so often people who watch you and all your programming or listen to the podcast, we can bore you to death with all the different cases because let's be realistic. As a defense lawyer, we like to say a lot of them are cookie cutter. So for us right now, really litigation's booming. But I think the key is to really break it down into specific segments. And let's start with sort of the basics. We've had the excessive fee lawsuits against plan sponsors. That's group one. Then I'm going to list a couple groups and then double back. Then we have the fee lawsuits against, I'll call it a product, whether it's proprietary product or some type of product. Then we have some other areas of lawsuits, which you mentioned privacy and cybersecurity and fraud lawsuits. And then we also have other very special lawsuits, whether it's actuarial factors in pension plans, the declining amount of church plan lawsuits, ESOPs or company stock. Those are a whole nother bunch of buckets. But what often gets the most attention are the fee lawsuits on plan sponsors and the service provider. What is your service basically too expensive? Is it conflicted? Those types of lawsuits. And those are the two that really get the bulk of the attention at this point. It started with 401k, but I think it's all defined contribution is under the microscope. It has typically been the private sector employer plans. There's been occasional governmental ones, but governmental plans have unique challenges for plaintiffs to bring. And as someone who works with governmental plans too, I'm happy to see it hasn't come over to that spot. But on the 401k plans, it's definitely grown. Part of what it is there have been lawsuits over fees and conflicts even way before 2006. But the modern era kind of began in the mid 2000s. And in the last 3-4 years, what you've seen is an explosion partially driven by other law firms that normally hadn't actually been in the 401k fee lawsuit space coming in. These are firms that might have done securities work or other types of class action work, or these are people who broke off and separated from big law firms, and they basically set up new practices elsewhere. So as people move around, you basically have more players. There's a couple players who become prolific filers, and you can, if you ask the plaintiff side, I'm sure they will say, well, we think deeply about each case and why we do it. If you ask the defense side, we're apt to say these complaints don't really say anything that you can win on, and they're cookie cutter. The courts are still slicing and dicing, but I think that's why you're seeing some more wins for the defense. Let's to be realistic, there are very few wins if you consider a win for a plaintiff a big monetary recovery. There's very few true wins in court. It's usually the defense wins, they fight it out, they win early, or they win after a long defense. Or what you also see is settlements. Settlements are huge. And that's a big example. Because take, for example, the Intel case. We've talked about it on the podcast many times. The Intel case is kind of a fee case, but it's also talking about the use of alternatives and defined contribution plans. But the decision in the most recent progress of the Intel case really went to say, look, we don't see that there's much of a claim stated here. Now, the plaintiffs can come back and refile, but you're seeing more and more courts do that, which is good for those who are interested in alts, but it's a broader takeaway in that case that simply because you have funds that may not be the absolute cheapest or may not have performed the best, it's not a 2020 hindsight. But because the settlements are so big, there's so much money here, and there's belief, I know, on the side of the plaintiffs that they think that they're doing good things. I think we can disagree. You're seeing these grow, and they've branched out from 401ks to 403bs. We're involved in a lot of this MEP litigation, so you're seeing it expand at this point. And each of these groups is different, and they often try to say it's the same exact argument. And ERISA is a consistent law, but each type of plan is a bit different. But the plaintiffs' lawyers are very smart, a lot of them, and they've really evolved. So that's kind of my takeaway on the fee litigation at this point. The current status, simply put, is I think it's important to break the segments. You have the lawsuits saying about security, and they blend between cybersecurity and fraud, and you're seeing a lot of a lot more of those cases where someone gets access. Sometimes there's a cyber element where they did it online, but a lot of the time it's old-fashioned fraud. But those cases are getting more visibility now, and you're seeing those move forward. And oftentimes they've been settling in a number of those cases, but people are still pushing those along because the days of larger margins for service providers and cost and just flexibility in budgets for corporate America have shrunk. So people are less willing to just automatically step up and say, I'm going to pay even if I didn't do it wrong. And I think that's something we're seeing there. But those types of breach cases often are settling. But separate and distinct, the privacy cases are really moving along. Privacy, at this point, there is the only decision that's really recent on this is the Northwestern decision in the 403B cases, which basically was a win for the defense about the use of plan information and privacy. But that hasn't stopped a bunch of the settlements in these cases from saying we're going to limit the use of data. There is a lawsuit like the one against Shell that's pending at this point that go into what's the use of data. My big takeaway is sometimes people are saying data is a plan asset. I think it's a jump to say that immediately. There's a lot of sort of issues, and this is Kevin's idea. I give him credit for it. Because if data is a plan asset, it becomes an infectious plan asset. Because unlike money where I give Jeff $10, if you give me $10, you don't have it anymore. But if I give you data, I still have a copy. So how do you make all this work? So I think we're in the early innings of this game at this point, but we'll have to see where it goes.
And I also spoke with Offutt Kerman's Tom Major to discuss how you can prevent eviction. Let's take a look.
So right now, evictions in New Jersey just aren't happening. There is a statewide eviction moratorium. There's a companion executive order from the governor that goes with it. But it essentially provides that there'll be no evictions except for evictions in the interest of justice. The laws don't really define what that means, what the interest of justice is. But suffice it to say, if there's a tenant who's just not paying rent, or if you are a tenant and you're not paying rent, the non-payment of rent alone right now is not, you can't be evicted. It's not a basis for eviction while the moratorium's in effect. And so the courts really aren't even holding landlord-tenant proceedings for reasons other than non-payment, on top of the fact that there's a moratorium. Interestingly, tenants who owe rent have a right to apply their security deposit to their unpaid balance. That's also an executive order of the 2020 vintage. And so there are some legal options for tenants not paying rent, but for the most part, everything is kind of in a holding pattern while we wait, for the new normal to arrive. The landlord-tenant practice, or the landlord-tenant relationship, is a small part of a much larger real estate environment that has all manner of codependencies built into it, and inputs and outputs that are built into it. Everything is interconnected in that way. Most of the time when people discuss a landlord-tenant relationship, it's very easy to think of it like like a Charles Dickens novel, where there's an evil landlord and a virtuous tenant, and it's all about good versus evil. In reality, the landlord-tenant relationship is just a small part of a much larger interconnected financial scheme. And so it benefits everyone to continue dialogue, or to initiate a dialogue, because one man's unpaid rent is another man or woman's unpaid mortgage. One person's default in rent is another person's default on a mortgage and a foreclosure. There's also an asymmetry in information county or statewide assistance programs for tenants who are suffering, and correspondingly landlords who are suffering. And it's just the information on these programs, or the awareness of these programs, is not evenly distributed. And so it is possible that someone's landlord may know more about assistance available to a tenant than the tenant him or herself, or that a tenant may be able to tell the landlord, I've applied for this program, it's available to me, I expect to have some money by this date, what can we do? The problem with the current state of affairs is that the only way to deal with these things is with black and white rules for the time being. And the problem with black and white rules is they tend to produce black and white results that nobody wants. We can mitigate some of that by working together and keeping a dialogue going, so that at least maybe we all benefit from a shade of gray. So the first thing to think of when someone's seeking out COVID-related information is always keep in mind that there are 3 layers of government, or 4 really, you're interacting with on a daily basis. There's your city, the county, the state, and the federal government. The federal government is the stuff that's in the news all the time, so it's really not hard to find out what's going on there. New Jersey has a very elegantly designed COVID-19 portal that the state manages, that provides all manner of resources for tenants struggling with paying rent or falling behind on utility payments, and also contains some basic information on do's and don'ts during COVID. But more than that, there are counties with county-specific relief programs, and there are even cities with city-specific relief programs. So, for example, in northern New Jersey, Jersey City has a specific tenant relief program. I believe Newark either has or is discussing a similar type program. And there are also county-level programs in Hudson and Essex, respectively, that sort of sit on top of that. And so the most likely place to find information is probably the state-level COVID-19 portal. But don't stop there. I would also check county level, city level, and then anything you could find at the federal level. We should make one point briefly, just to clarify the current state of affairs. The courts are holding hearings on a case-by-case basis for specific landlord-tenant cases. Your run-of-the-mill non-payment case is not being heard, but if there are emergent circumstances, damage, assault, or something really compelling, the Supreme Court has created a system in which a landlord can seek a trial on a landlord-tenant matter if the circumstances are sufficiently emergent. As for how things look when the new normal arrives, I'm not so sure anyone really knows, because in New Jersey, eviction actions are separate from simply owing somebody money. So in a landlord-tenant case, all the landlord gets is the right to take the apartment back and remove the tenant. It has nothing to do with the payment of money. Now, practically speaking, the payment of money to the landlord, either in settlement or in whole, ends up obviating the need for an eviction. So the two are tied in that sense. But in reality, if a landlord wins in the landlord-tenant case, all they get is the apartment back and the money's in the wind. The current state of affairs doesn't allow for eviction cases, meaning possession of the apartment, but it says nothing about someone's existing and accruing obligation to pay rent. And so what you could have is, when the new normal arrives, a bunch of tenants in possession of an apartment while getting sued separately for the money that they owe, which they can't pay. And squaring those two, I don't think, or at least I haven't heard of any method for squaring those two. A tenant in possession of an apartment for over a year without paying, while a simultaneous civil action for the money is proceeding.
And that wraps up this episode of BRN Weekly. Have a topic of interest, someone you think we should talk to, then drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the information in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, so much more, all in one place, check out today's edition of our newsletter, The Morning Pulse. Don't forget, we're back again tomorrow for our regular show, BRN Sunday. I'll be joined by members of the media, academia, and financial services. So until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.
Are you being audited, and do you owe the IRS $10,000 or more in back taxes? Is the IRS threatening to take more of your money? Don't fight the IRS alone. The Tax Doctor is here to help you negotiate your tax bill and reduce your stress. The IRS can freeze your assets and seize your bank accounts, but you can stop these IRS actions. The Tax Doctor will work with you using our years of experience to represent your case to help you get the best resolution under the IRS guidelines. Help is here to deal with the IRS to reduce your stress. We've handled thousands of cases, so we know what we're doing. If you owe $10,000 or more in back taxes, do not call the IRS alone. Call a Tax Doctor now for a tax emergency analysis.
Call 800-224-6439.